We are finishing our sermon series in wisdom. We have been talking about the book of Proverbs, and we have been going over chapter 3 of Proverbs for the past few months. We started from verse 1, and we're ending today in verse 35. So we finished the entire chapter. And today we're finishing the chapter, and today, the whole time that we've been studying Proverbs, we have been trying to convey this message to everybody at church, at GVC, young and old, about the importance of having wisdom, pursuing wisdom as Christians. And as I was studying the passage today, it made me realize that it's actually a lot more important than we think. This pursuit of wisdom is a lot more serious than we think. Because according to, the book of Proverbs, depending on whether we search, find, and live in wisdom or not is a matter of life and death. It's that important. Having wisdom or not, in this life and in the life to come, it's a matter of life and death. And here's why. Wisdom will lead us to make choices that lead to life. Real life, like really being alive, really being full of life, the life of shalom, the life of wellness, right? And this is found only through wisdom. Now, when Proverbs is talking about life, it's talking about length of life, of course, but more than that, it's talking about quality of life. Like here on earth, we can really have life, or we can have death. Still alive physically, but dead nonetheless. The quality of life, the choices that we make every day lead more towards death, which eventually leads life to death, even though we're still alive. But that's just how it feels. The quality of life is closer to a sense of death rather than life. And this is why, if we really want to live, if we really want life, then it's essential that we find and pursue and don't lose sight of wisdom if we want to live, life to the fullest. Today, we wanted to conclude our chapter on Proverbs by studying how we can by studying the context on which wisdom grows. There's a context that we need to be a part of if we want to grow in wisdom. And today, we're going to see what that context that we need to be a part of is so that we can continue to be in wisdom and continue to grow in wisdom. So if you have your Bibles, please open with me to the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verses 25 through 35. Once again, that's Proverbs 3, chapter 3, verses 25 to 35. It's quite long, so we're not going to read it. You can read it on your own when you go home. But this is the passage for today. Proverbs 3, chapter 3, verses 25 through 35. And I just wanted to do a little recap of some of the main themes that we talked about from chapter 3, especially since we have a lot of people that weren't with us when we were going through the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, so that you can kind of get an idea of what we talked about, and also just so that we can conclude our chapter today by sort of reminding ourselves about some of the things that we learned the past few weeks. One of the things that, if you remember from Proverbs chapter 3, was that Proverbs chapter 3 took us back to the tree of life, right? It took us back to the book of Genesis. It took us back to seeing how it took us back to seeing how life was perfect with God. But when Adam and Eve were living with God in the Garden of Eden and in paradise in the beginning, but everything for them collapsed the moment Adam and Eve, rather than living in fellowship with God, living in obedience to God, they wanted to be God. Remember, that's what sort of like, they ate from the fruit that God told them not to eat from. And the reason why they made that choice was because they no longer wanted God to tell them how to live or what to do. They wanted to be like God. They wanted to just do whatever they wanted. And that, in essence, led to sin entering the universe, and fellowship with God was broken, and they started to suffer from that point on. But it's so beautiful that Proverbs chapter 3 talks about the tree of life, because it was showing us how when we find wisdom, wisdom leads us back to the garden. Remember, that's what we talked about in chapter 3. Wisdom leads us back to the tree of life. Wisdom leads us back to the life of shalom before everything, God became fallen and broken because of sin. That life where there was rich fellowship with God and everything was perfect. The life of beauty. When we find wisdom, wisdom leads us back to the Garden of Eden, to fellowship with God, to the life of shalom. Not only that, wisdom also talked about, the creation of the world, the beginning. This chapter 3 talked about how God created everything in the beginning. It talked about the creation. And it was so important to hear Proverbs talk about creation, because it took us again back to the book of Genesis. But what it was trying to show us is that when we find wisdom, we find the same wisdom that God used to create the universe. God created a beautiful universe, a beautiful world. And what Proverbs was trying to show us was that when we find wisdom, our broken and fallen lives can become beautiful again like God's creation. This is why wisdom leads to life. Because when we live in wisdom, we are living in the same wisdom that God used to create a beautiful universe, a beautiful beginning to everything. So when we choose the path of wisdom, that's how our lives become. Our lives become beautiful. Just like how when God, in the beginning, created the universe. So each day for you and me as Christians or non-Christians, we're making a choice. There's no neutral. Everybody's making a choice. Each day, all of us are growing closer and walking in the path of wisdom, or we're growing in the path of destruction, where there's no wisdom, where the only wisdom that we find is wisdom in our own eyes. The same kind of wisdom that Eve fell for when she ate the forbidden fruit, that looked good in her eyes. It wasn't true wisdom. It led to destruction and fallenness. There's no neutral. Each day we're growing far wiser by the choices that we make in the path of wisdom, or we're growing more and more as fools in the path of foolishness. The definition of a fool in the Bible is the literal definition is somebody that says there is no God. That's how the Bible describes a fool. Somebody who says, after they see everything that they see in creation and everything that we see, somebody who, after seeing all of that, in the end says there is no God. So those are some of the things that we looked at in this chapter alone, only one chapter, how wisdom brings us back to the garden days. Wisdom takes us back to the garden, takes us back to fellowship with God, takes us back to when life life was just perfect. I'm not saying life will be perfect in this life. That's impossible. But it takes us very close to living a quality of life where it's true life. And not only that, but every choice that we make, every step that we take leads us to building a more and more beautiful life, because that's what wisdom does. Today, we see the context of how we grow in wisdom. I want you to notice something from verses 25 to 35, 10 verses. They all start with do not. Do not. Do not be afraid. Do not say to your neighbor. Do not plan evil against your neighbor. Do not contend with a man for no reason. Do not, and the neighbor. So what this passage is showing us is that wisdom only grows in the context of community. Only in the context of community, wisdom grows. Right? It's talking about how to live in a context of a community, how to treat neighbor, how to love neighbor. And a very interesting thing is that that I want to share with you was the first 10 verses of this chapter, 10 verses of chapter 3, they all talk about how to love and honor God. The last 10 verses talk about how to love and honor neighbor. So what does that mean? Does that bring something in your mind? Have you heard that somewhere else before? Loving God and loving neighbor? Right? That's the greatest commandment in the Bible. Right? Where Jesus says to love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love neighbor as yourself. Proverbs 3 is teaching us wisdom itself grows, wisdom is, and wisdom grows in the context of loving God and loving neighbor. Wisdom grows when we come out of ourselves to not only live for ourselves, but when we are forced to be in a context, in a community where we're forced to love others, other than ourselves. Where we're forced to learn and grow in our knowledge and ability to love God and our ability to love neighbor. That's the context where wisdom grows in. Only when we are each day doing the hard work of trying to live with broken people that are hurting, that hurt us, that are difficult to deal with, only when we don't run away from that kind of setting, only when we don't hide when things get hard, only when we stay in community and learn how to love and live in that kind of difficult context, by learning how to love God and loving neighbor, will we become people of wisdom. There is no other way. As a matter of fact, a way to not grow in wisdom is to withdraw. A way to not grow in wisdom is to be isolated from everyone. A way to not grow in wisdom is to just live for ourselves. Right? That's what this proverb is trying to teach us. Right? It's something that we've been repeating from time to time as we have been studying this chapter, that this proverb is trying to help us see the fantasy of self-sufficiency and to help us understand the reality of God dependency. Right? How it's a fantasy to think that we can do life on our own. Is a fantasy and is a counterfeit kind of life that doesn't lead to life, but it seems like it leads to life, but it doesn't lead to life, it leads to death. It's a counterfeit, it's a fantasy to think that if we're just living for ourselves, if we just do whatever we want, life is going to be great. That's a counterfeit, that's a fantasy. He's trying to help us see how we shouldn't fall in that kind of counterfeit fantasy life, just like Eve did when she was being wise in her own eyes, and we should see that life cannot be done. We cannot find life outside of a life that is in fellowship and in obedience to God. That's where life is found. That's where life is found. Life is only found when we are living in fellowship and in obedience to God. Life is only found when our purpose in life is to love God and love neighbor. You see, this passage is trying to show us a few things. The reason why it's connecting love of God and love of neighbor is because ancient, people that lived back then, they had a clear understanding of one thing. They knew how easy it was for a human being, for a Christian, for a believer. Doesn't matter how long we have been Christians, how easy it is for a Christian at any given moment to forget God, to forget to fear God, to forget to love God, to forget to live for God, and so easily become about self. They knew that so well. Even back then, they knew how it was so easy, if the believer wasn't careful, to quickly forget God. But they also knew something else. They knew that the moment you forget God, the moment you and I forget God, the next thing that happens is we forget neighbor. We forget how to love other people around us. It's connected. When we forget God, when we forget to fear God, when we forget to love God, then naturally what happens is our hearts grow cold and we cannot love neighbor either. That's what this passage is trying to show us. And that's when we lose wisdom, and that's when it leads to the same kind of outcome that Adam and Eve had when they forgot God and they became all about themselves and they tried to become God. The Bible says that the essence of sin is living for ourselves. Living for ourselves. In this generation, that's perhaps the biggest problem, right? Doesn't matter young or old, one of the biggest problems that we are seeing in our generation is how quickly people are forgetting God and how we have made life all about self. If I'm happy, that's all that I care about. Now, I think previous generation, older generations, like some of our members here and myself, we were pretty good at hiding that. I think perhaps a lot of us also, maybe we weren't really living for God or loving God, but somehow, some way, we know how to be Christian and not to really show the reality of what's in our hearts. That what we really care about is not God, but self. We were pretty good at hiding the fact that, all of us are, in some sense, all of us are Eves, Adam and Eves, in our hearts. We would have made the same choice that Eve made of eating the forbidden fruit. And the reason why I know this is because we sometimes make that choice every day. We make that choice every day of, pretending in some ways to love God and live for God, but in our hearts, the center of it all, it's me, my well-being, and my happiness. But previous generations, I think, including myself, we're pretty good at, in a sense, hiding that. This new generation, they call them the Generation Z, I think, is college and below. The millennials are old now. Millennials move over, you don't matter anymore. The new generation is Generation Z, which is college and below. And, they're not hiding it. We're pretty good at hiding it. They're not hiding it. There's been studies that have been done, and it's kind of early because, they're kind of a new generation. But there's studies that have been, done, and they show that the majority of them, they don't care about God. They don't care about God. They honestly say, and they have no problem saying that God is not a big part of their lives, and they're not really too much into God. They could care less about God. This is the first generation that has actually honestly admitted that. Up until the millennials, millennials still, God was somewhat important in their lives. That's what the studies show. But the new generation Z, it's too many letters, Generation Z, they honestly admit that God is not important in their lives. They don't care too much about God. But also, studies have shown that this generation, the new generation growing up, is one of the most insecure generations that we've had. They're being identified as a generation that is insecure. Because of many different, reasons, but primarily because they don't grow with God. Right? Remember last week or a couple of weeks ago we talked about how, the beginning of wisdom, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. How as Christians, the more we learn how to fear the Lord, the less and less we fear everything else until we fear nothing. Right? The more we grow in our relationship with God, the more God becomes bigger in our lives. The more we fear the Lord, the more we fellowship with Him. We start to fear nothing else, and we become very stable and secure people. On the other hand, the less people fear God, the less there is the fear of the Lord in somebody's life, the less people fear God, the more they will fear everything else. That's just how it works. We fear God and we don't fear nothing else over time. Or we don't fear God, we choose to not fear God, and then we fear everything else that life brings our way. That's how it works. So know God, and this generation is giving us an example of how this is playing out in real life. They don't care about God, and just in the same way, their biggest struggle is insecurity. They struggle with insecurity, loneliness, and they're confused and isolated. They don't feel safe. Let me read you a quote by Tim Keller. This is what it says. Ancient wisdom taught that you would thrive as a person only if you put the needs of your family and community above your own self-interest. Our modern culture rejects that entirely. We are told to be true to ourselves, to decide who we want to be, and then to demand that our community and family recognize and honor that regardless of its impact on relationships. Today, we sacrifice the good of the group for the absolute freedom of the individual. The result is an increasing number of people who feel disconnected and lonely. That's, what this passage is trying to show us. Right? That the more we make life about self by forgetting God and neighbor, what we're going to find is insecurity, loneliness, and disconnection. We're not going to find life. We're going to find more forms of death, one way or another. It's just going to lead to more and more death where we're still alive, but we're just as good as dead because what we taste every day is just a little bit more of what death feels like, not life. And, and that's That's what this passage is showing us. Right? That wisdom is a matter of life and death. If we pursue after wisdom, if we grow in wisdom, wisdom alone has the power to bring us back to the garden days. Right? That's how we started the sermon, right? Wisdom brings us back to the garden days in the very beginning, to the tree of life. Wisdom brings us back to the creation of the universe, of how a beautiful life is built. Wisdom is what leads us to taste more and more of life as we make choices every single day that lead to wisdom. There's life to be found in wisdom. Wisdom alone has the power to give us that life. And the wisdom today that we learn is that we are only wise when we don't live just for ourselves, which is what this generation is so big about. Everybody's so big about me, my desires, and my will, and that's what is killing all of us. That's what's killing all of us. We're demanding that everybody just adjust to what we want and desire. We're sacrificing everything on the altar of me, myself, and what I want. And we're killing us. And we're killing those around us. Wisdom is when we forget about us. When we don't make life about us. Not that we don't care. We care, we matter, we take care of ourselves. But wisdom starts when we can see that life is found, that wisdom is found when we live to love God and to love others. Wisdom starts when we put others before us. Wisdom grows in the context of community. Community with God and community with other people and Christians as well. There's no other way. And only then will we taste more life. Wisdom alone can take us back to the garden. Wisdom alone can give us fellowship with God, to love God and to love neighbor. And wisdom has a name. His name is Jesus Christ. I mean, think about it. Jesus is the only one who didn't live for himself, but completely gave up himself. Right? His wisdom, living wisdom. Wisdom's name is Jesus Christ. He's the only one who could have lived just for himself. He had everything. That in the entire universe and beyond, everything belonged to him. But he's the only one who didn't live for himself, who wasn't a fool, but he was wise. He's wisdom. And he gave up his life for others. For others. Jesus gave up perfect community with the Trinity, with the Father, with the Holy Spirit. He gave up his perfect home. And he came to die lonely and alone. Right? He gave it all up and he still died lonely and alone. And do you know why? It is so that you and I will never ever be lonely and alone ever again. It is so that he can walk with us, so that we will never be ever again lonely or disconnected or alone. Jesus had to give everything up. He had to come die lonely and alone, because that was the only way he can walk with you and me. From the moment we put our trust in Christ, from that moment on, he can walk with you and me, so that we will never be alone, never be lonely for the rest of eternity. Not only in this life, but for the rest of eternity. We will never be alone ever again because Jesus walks with us every single day. And he had to come and die lonely and alone so that he can walk with us every single day. Jesus lost his paradise, his perfect home, his perfect relationship with the Father, community with the Father and the Spirit, to give you and me the garden again. To give you and me a perfect home again. You see, when we come to Christ, we head back to the garden. His wisdom is a path back to the garden days. Jesus lost his perfect garden, so you and I can now go back to the garden and be with God and fellowship with God and enjoy the beauty of who God is and learn more and more each and every day what it means, what it feels like to love God with all of our hearts, mind, soul, and strength, and to love neighbor as ourselves. Jesus is wisdom. Wisdom has a name. His name is Jesus Christ. And when we walk with him, we will never be alone. We will never be lonely. We will taste the garden days once again. And we will know what it means to get out of ourselves, to not be self-centered, but to learn how to love God with all of our hearts, mind, soul, and strength, and to love neighbor as ourselves. We will know what wisdom is. We will be on the path of wisdom. Now we have more guests and people are returning than usual. So I'm a little nervous preaching today because the crowd is bigger. But I also didn't want to waste this opportunity. Whether you know Jesus Christ or not, I just want to ask you one thing. If you don't know Jesus, or if you have been coming to church for a long time but you still haven't accepted Christ yet, I just want to ask you one thing. Has that choice led you to life? I just don't look at anybody around you, but just ask yourself that question honestly. I mean, you can still reject Christ and you can still not, like Christianity at the end of this, and I will pray for you and we will still love you, but I want you to ask one thing. Has walking further from Christ, has that led to life? Do you find life at the other side of Christ? Do you find wisdom? Do you find life, truly being alive? Do you find yourself making the choices that lead to life? If that's you, and if you found a way to do that without Christ, then talk to me after and show me how you do that. But if you don't have Christ, and if you have tried everything else in life that promised you to take you back to the garden days, that promised you life, but you found out that temporarily maybe they give you some excitement, but overall it leads to death. If that's you, then there's a reason why you keep on falling for these things and you keep on not finding life. It's because life is only found in Jesus Christ. So I want to invite you. If you don't know Christ yet, if you don't know Jesus yet, I want to invite you to change your life forever. I can guarantee you one thing, and if it doesn't work, come to me. I will buy you Brazilian barbecue. But I can bank 100,000 Brazilian barbecue lunches on this. Because I know it's real, because I know it's true. Jesus will make your life better. Or He will make you so much better at life. You will see the difference. You will have life. You will know what life looks like. You will come out of death into life. Even if you don't see it now, you will see and taste what life feels like. I want to invite you to life. I want to invite you to really live. The only thing you have to do is ask Jesus right now. Jesus, I don't get it. I don't understand everything. I just want to know. Just that one simple prayer. Starts, there's a lot more that needs to be taken care of once you start your relationship with Christ. But to just get started, just pray. Just on your own. And tell Jesus, Jesus, I want life. Jesus, you alone can give life. Jesus, I want to know you today. Let's take a moment to pray for that. Just you and God. And if we can have the praise team come up and lead us into instrumental music. But just take some time to have your life revolutionized today. Totally changed and transformed. To really taste life. This can be the day where you can really give thanks. Not because of any gift that you receive, but because you have received the gift of life. Jesus will lead you out of loneliness, out of insecurity, will lead you back to the garden days. Jesus will show you, teach you, and give you life. Take a moment to pray. Just try it. Just try it. Nothing else has worked up to this point. And nothing else will. You can stop running and you can stop falling for the wrong things today. This is the day you can stop. You can finally rest in Christ alone. Because He is all you need.